I woke up to the sound of laughter, music, and the unmistakable scent of fresh flowers, and that was weird, because I hadn't planned a party. I blinked a few times, rubbing my eyes as I looked out the window. My yard, my private property, the land I had worked hard to maintain, had somehow transformed overnight into a full-scale wedding venue. Rows of pristine white chairs lined the lawn, leading up to an elegant floral arch. A catering station was set up near my barn, with chefs in crisp white uniforms busily preparing hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played soft classical music near the pond. And standing at the center of it all, barking orders like she was the queen of the universe, was none other than Karen, the HOA president who had made it her life's mission to pretend my land was hers to control. I stormed outside, my boots crunching against the gravel, my heart pounding with a mix of confusion and rage. This had to be a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong property? Maybe some event planner had botched the location details? But as I got closer, I spotted a massive banner that read, "Welcome to the wedding of Sophia and James." Not a single name I recognized. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was pure entitlement, HOA style. Karen turned around just as I reached the first row of chairs, her face lighting up with fake delight. "Oh, good morning, Jake," she chirped, waving a clipboard at me like she was some kind of benevolent event planner. "Isn't it just gorgeous? The community is going to love this." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, what the hell is this?" She laughed, a light, airy sound that made my fists clench. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a small wedding. We needed the perfect outdoor venue, and honestly, your yard was the best option. You should feel honored. The bride's family is very prestigious, you know." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Karen, this is my land. You can't just set up a wedding here without my permission." Karen rolled her eyes like I was some petulant child. "Oh, don't be silly. It's for the good of the community. Besides, we tried reaching out, but you never answered your phone." "That's because you never called me," I snapped. "You can't just decide to throw a wedding on someone's private property." She huffed, flipping through the pages on her clipboard like she was reading from some imaginary rulebook. "The HOA guidelines allow for community events in appropriate locations." I crossed my arms. "Karen, for the 100th time, I am not part of the HOA." Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Technicalities. You live here, don't you? That means you should contribute to the community. It's just one day. Stop making a fuss." Before I could respond, the bride and groom approached, looking thrilled to see me. The bride, a woman with perfectly styled blonde hair, beamed. "Oh, you must be Jake. Thank you so much for letting us use your land. It's breathtaking." "I didn't let you use anything," I said through gritted teeth. "Karen set this up without asking me." The groom, a smug-looking man in an overpriced suit, chuckled. "Oh, come on, man. No harm, no foul, right? It's just one day. Besides, we already paid for everything, and the guests are on their way." I ran a hand down my face, feeling my patience slipping. "You paid? To who?" Karen piped up, her voice dripping with condescension. "To the HOA, of course. A very reasonable fee, if I do say so myself." I stared at her, my brain refusing to process the sheer level of audacity. She had not only stolen my property for this event, but had also made money off it? My land. My space. And she had the nerve to act like she was doing me a favor? "Oh, and by the way," Karen added, flipping through her notes, "the catering trucks had trouble parking, so we had them use your driveway. Hope that's not a problem." I turned and, sure enough, my driveway was blocked by multiple vehicles. Trucks, vans, and even a damn limousine. There was no way to move my own truck if I needed to leave. My stomach twisted with rage. I took a step forward, lowering my voice so only Karen could hear. "Move it. All of it. Now." Karen scoffed. "Jake, don't be unreasonable. The ceremony starts in an hour. Just go inside and relax. It'll all be over soon." I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. My land had been taken over. My driveway was blocked. Strangers were trampling my grass. Karen was making money off my property. And now I was expected to relax, while a bunch of entitled people played pretend in my backyard? No. Not happening. Karen turned away, already basking in the glow of her self-importance, waving at arriving guests as if she owned the place. The bride and groom had gone back to their preparations, completely unfazed by my growing fury. I exhaled slowly, then pulled out my phone. "Hey," I said when my farmhand picked up. "Open the back gate and let them out." There was a pause. "All of them?" I glanced at Karen, who was now chatting happily with some HOA members. "Every single one." The farmhand laughed. "Got it, boss." I slipped my phone back in my pocket and strolled over to the buffet table, casually grabbing a skewer of shrimp. If they wanted a wedding in my yard, they were about to get a real farm experience. Jake stood by the buffet table, chewing on a shrimp skewer as he watched Karen bask in the attention of arriving guests. She moved through the crowd like a self-appointed queen, shaking hands, offering fake laughs, and acting like she owned the land beneath her feet. The bride and groom were caught up in the whirlwind of last-minute wedding preparations, completely unbothered by the fact that they were essentially trespassing on someone else's property. Jake's eyes flicked toward the barn in the distance. He knew what was coming, and the anticipation sent a spark of satisfaction through him. Karen and her guests had no idea that their perfectly curated event was about to turn into pure chaos. The first sign of trouble came when the caterers near the barn suddenly froze. One of them, a man in a chef's coat and black cap, pointed toward the open gate with wide eyes. The next second, a loud, deep moo echoed across the yard, followed by the heavy thud of hooves against the grass. Jake took another bite of shrimp. Showtime. A wave of cows came charging through the open gate, their large bodies moving with surprising speed for creatures their size. Some were lazily chewing hay, others were excited by their newfound freedom, and one particularly feisty bull, named Diesel, was already targeting the towering wedding cake near the buffet. The chaos was instantaneous. Guests screamed as cows barreled through the seating area, knocking over chairs and sending delicate floral arrangements flying through the air. The bride shrieked in horror as Diesel made direct contact with the cake, smashing it into a pile of ruined frosting and crushed layers. The groom jumped back just in time to avoid getting splattered, but his pristine white suit was already dusted with dirt from the cows kicking up the grass. Karen's face went through several rapid changes: confusion, shock, and then absolute rage. She whirled toward Jake, her voice shrill. "What did you do?" Jake wiped his mouth with a napkin and tossed the skewer into the mess Diesel had made. Looks like my cows didn't get the wedding invite. Guess they wanted to crash the party." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She turned back to the wedding disaster unfolding around her. A group of older guests were frantically trying to escape the chaos, but a cow had decided to make itself comfortable near the exit, effectively blocking the way. Another guest had the misfortune of stepping directly into a fresh pile of manure, his expensive shoes ruined. Then came the goat. Smaller, faster, and infinitely more mischievous, they darted through the yard with wild enthusiasm. One goat leaped onto the gift table, sending neatly wrapped presents flying in all directions. Another managed to climb onto the DJ's sound system, its little hooves stomping all over the controls, causing the classical wedding music to warp into an unholy mix of distorted sounds. The goose was last. And it was angry. Jake's favorite troublemaker, a big white goose named Sergeant Honkers, took one look at the chaos and decided to establish dominance. With a loud, aggressive honk, it flapped its wings and charged toward the nearest victim, the groom. The man let out a strangled yelp as Sergeant Honkers nipped at his leg, flapping wildly in what could only be described as a one-sided battle for territory. The bride, in absolute distress, tried to pull the goose away, but that only made Sergeant Honkers angrier. Jake leaned against the buffet table, watching it all unfold like it was a prime-time reality show. Karen, now red-faced and shaking with rage, turned to him again. You did this on purpose. Call them off. Jake shrugged. They live here. You're the ones trespassing. The guests were in full panic mode now. Some had climbed onto chairs to avoid the cows. A group of bridesmaids had taken shelter behind the catering table, peering out in horror as a particularly curious goat chewed on the hem of their dresses. One older gentleman had taken a defensive stance against Sergeant Honkers, waving a napkin in a desperate attempt to assert dominance. The bride burst into tears. My wedding is ruined. The groom, still fighting off the goose, snapped, Who the hell throws a wedding on someone else's property without asking? Jake smirked at Karen. Great question. Karen, now realizing just how deep she was in trouble, tried to salvage the situation. Everyone, please remain calm. This is just a minor inconvenience. A loud crash cut her off. One of the cows had wandered too close to the drink station, knocking over the entire table of champagne glasses. Expensive bubbly spilled onto the ground, mixing with the dirt and remnants of the destroyed cake. Jake took a deep breath, enjoying the sweet, sweet smell of karma. Karen finally lost it. I'm calling the police. Jake clapped his hands together. Oh, please do. I'd love to see how they handle an unauthorized wedding on private property. Karen froze, her brain working overtime to find a way out of this mess. Meanwhile, a few guests had managed to make their escape, running toward their parked cars in a desperate bid for freedom. The bride was still sobbing, her makeup streaking down her face as she clutched the remains of her bouquet like it was the only thing holding her together. The groom, having finally escaped the wrath of Sergeant Honkers, glared at Karen with pure hatred. This was your idea, he spat, brushing feathers off his suit. You told us everything was taken care of. Karen, now on the verge of a complete breakdown, tried to regain control. It was taken care of. This is just unbelievable, the groom muttered. He turned to Jake, sighing in exhaustion. Look, man. I don't know what the hell this woman told you, but I swear we had no idea this wasn't allowed. If I had known, we never would have come here. Jake studied him for a moment, then gave a nod. The guy was still an entitled jerk, but at least he wasn't as delusional as Karen. The bride, in between sobs, finally snapped. Karen, you ruined my wedding. Karen, utterly defeated, could do nothing but stand there as the weight of the disaster came crashing down around her. Jake stretched his arms, feeling more relaxed than he had in weeks. Well, he said, grabbing another snack from the now empty buffet table, I'd say this has been an eventful day. Karen shot him a murderous glare, but she knew she had no ground to stand on anymore. The wedding was officially over. The guests were either gone or trying to clean themselves up. The venue, the one she had so proudly organized, was now a chaotic mess of farm animals, ruined decorations, and absolute humiliation. Jake took one last look at the scene before casually strolling back toward his house. Behind him, Sergeant Honkers let out one final victory honk, sending Karen into another round of panicked screeching. Best wedding ever. Karen stood in the middle of the wreckage, her designer blouse stained with frosting, her hair frizzing from the humidity, and her entire reputation hanging by a thread. The once beautiful wedding setup now looked like a battlefield. Chairs were overturned, decorations trampled, and half-eaten food scattered across the grass, thanks to the curious cows that were still wandering around, chewing on whatever they found interesting. The bride sat on the ground, sobbing into what remained of her veil, while the groom paced back and forth, muttering curses under his breath. Some guests were still trying to flee, while others stood frozen in shock, watching the aftermath like they had just survived a natural disaster. Jake leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, watching Karen's meltdown with quiet amusement. She kept opening and closing her mouth, trying to find the right words, but nothing was coming out. Her HOA board members had gathered around her, some whispering among themselves, while others were blatantly glaring at her, realizing just how deeply she had screwed up. The first voice of accusation came from the bride's mother, a woman who had spent the past half-hour alternating between screaming at the destruction and dabbing her daughter's tears with a monogrammed handkerchief. "Karen, you told us everything was taken care of. You said this was a legitimate venue. You told us the owner had agreed." Her voice rose to an ear-piercing shriek at the last word, making a few guests wince. Karen's lips trembled as she tried to regain control. "Well, it was supposed to be. I mean, Jake wasn't using his yard for anything important, so I thought." The bride's father, a man who looked like he had just realized he had wasted a small fortune, took a menacing step forward. "You thought? Do you have any idea how much this wedding cost? We paid the HOA for this. Thousands of dollars. And now look at it." He swept his arm across the chaos. A cow had wandered over to what was left of the wedding arch, and was now lazily chewing on the fabric drapes. The gift table had been completely overturned, with envelopes and presents scattered across the dirt. The sound system had been destroyed by an enthusiastic goat, which was still standing triumphantly on the speaker like it had conquered a small mountain. Karen waved her hands wildly, looking for someone to blame. Her gaze landed on Jake, and her expression twisted into one of pure hatred. "This is your fault. You let your animals loose on purpose. You sabotaged this wedding." Jake raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Yeah? And who gave you permission to throw a wedding on my land in the first place?" The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. Some of them were already starting to back away, realizing this was not a fight they wanted to be a part of. One of them, an older woman with large glasses, finally spoke up. "Karen, you told us Jake had agreed to this. That's the only reason we approved it." Jake let out a dry laugh. "Approved? You don't get to approve anything on my property. I don't belong to the HOA, remember?" Karen's mouth flapped like a fish gasping for air. Her carefully crafted world was crumbling around her, and she had no idea how to stop it. The bride, now wiping mascara-streaked tears off her face, shot Karen a venomous glare. "You lied to us. You lied to everyone." The groom, still brushing hay off his suit, ran a hand down his face, exhaling loudly. "We're getting our money back. Every single penny." Karen let out a nervous laugh, a high-pitched, brittle sound that didn't fool anyone. "Oh, well, we'll have to discuss that with the HOA Treasury Department." The bride's father stepped forward again, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "You mean the Treasury Department that you control?" Karen gulped, realizing just how bad this was. The HOA had taken money from an event that had no legal right to exist in the first place. And now, people wanted their money back. Jake watched with satisfaction as the guests, one by one, turned against her. Even the other HOA members were starting to distance themselves. Someone muttered something about a misuse of funds and a vote to remove leadership. It was getting ugly for Karen, and it was about to get worse. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't escalate any further, sirens wailed in the distance. The police had arrived. Karen whirled around in panic. "Oh, thank God. Officers. Arrest him. Arrest Jake. He set his animals loose and destroyed this wedding." Two uniformed officers stepped onto the scene, taking in the absolute disaster before them. One of them adjusted his hat, while the other pulled out a notepad. "So, whose property is this?" Jake casually raised his hand. "Mine." The officer nodded. "And you didn't give permission for this event?" "Nope." Karen let out a strangled noise. "He's lying. He's just trying to cause problems." The officer ignored her and turned back to Jake. "And these folks paid the HOA to have an event here?" Jake nodded, gesturing to the still angry bride's family. "Yup. Paid Karen, specifically." The officer turned to Karen. "So, you charged money for an event on land you don't own?" Karen's face went pale. She stammered, looking for a way out, but she had none. The bride's father stepped forward, pulling out his phone. "And we have all the receipts." Karen looked like she wanted to vanish into thin air. The officers exchanged glances before one of them spoke again. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you some questions down at the station." The gasp from the crowd was audible. Karen's eyes widened in terror. What? No. This is ridiculous. I didn't do anything wrong. Jake smirked. "Tell that to the judge." As the officers led a protesting, screeching Karen toward their patrol car, the rest of the guests slowly began gathering their things. The bride, still shaken, gave Jake one last glance. "For what it's worth." "I'm sorry." Jake gave a small nod. "Next time, double-check who actually owns the venue before paying." She sighed, defeated, before walking off with her parents. The groom followed, still looking like he was questioning every life decision that had led him to this moment. The remaining HOA members, seeing their fearless leader taken away in the back of a police car, shuffled awkwardly, mumbling something about an emergency meeting. One of them, an older man with a serious expression, turned to Jake. "We'll, be in touch." Jake simply grinned. "Looking forward to it." As the last car pulled out of his driveway and the sound of sirens faded in the distance, Jake stretched his arms, letting out a satisfied sigh. Sergeant Honkers strutted past him, fluffing his feathers like a true victor. Jake patted him on the back. "Good work, soldier." And with that, he turned toward his house, already wondering what kind of ridiculous scheme the HOA would try next. Whatever it was, he'd be ready. Jake woke up the next morning expecting peace and quiet, but the universe clearly had other plans. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the nightstand, and when he finally answered, his farmhand's voice came through, half amused, half exasperated. "Boss, you might want to check your front yard. You've got visitors." Jake groaned, throwing off his blanket and dragging himself out of bed. He had hoped that after the complete and utter humiliation Karen had suffered yesterday, she and the HOA would lay low for a while. Apparently, he had underestimated just how deep Karen's delusion ran. When he stepped outside, he was greeted by the sight of an official-looking city vehicle parked near his fence. Two men in button-up shirts and slacks stood by the truck, their hands on their hips, surveying his land. And standing beside them, speaking animatedly while waving a thick folder of documents, was none other than Karen. Jake sighed, adjusting his hat as he made his way over. "Morning, gentlemen. Something I can help you with?" One of the men turned toward him, giving him a polite but firm nod. "Mr. Jake, we received multiple complaints regarding violations on your property. We're here to conduct an inspection." Jake barely kept from rolling his eyes. "Complaints? From who?" The second man cleared his throat and glanced at Karen, who put on her best concerned citizen face. "From several members of the Homeowners Association," she said sweetly, as if she hadn't just been publicly humiliated in front of half the town. "You see, your farm animals are causing disturbances. We also received reports that your property is being used in ways that violate local zoning regulations." Jake folded his arms. "Zoning violations? That's interesting, considering I've owned this land for years and haven't had a single issue until now." Karen gave a dramatic sigh, clutching the folder to her chest. "It's not personal, Jake. It's just about maintaining the integrity of the community. After yesterday's unfortunate incident, several residents expressed concern about whether your land is properly regulated." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "So let me get this straight. You stole my land for a wedding, got caught, got arrested, and now, suddenly, I'm the problem." Karen's face twitched, but she quickly composed herself. "It's not about the past, Jake. It's about moving forward." The first inspector gave a small cough, looking mildly uncomfortable with the tension. "We just need to take a look around, Mr. Jake. If everything checks out, we'll be on our way." Jake considered telling them to leave, but then again, he had nothing to hide. If anything, he wanted to see just how far Karen was willing to take this ridiculous revenge scheme. He stepped aside and gestured toward the land. "Be my guest." The inspectors got to work, walking around, making notes, occasionally glancing back at Karen, who trailed behind them like a smug shadow. She kept pointing at things, the barn, the fencing, even the water troughs, as if she expected them to find something incriminating. But the longer the inspection went on, the more frustrated she became. The inspectors finally returned to Jake, flipping through their note. "Well, Mr. Jake, everything seems to be in compliance. Your land is properly zoned for agricultural use, your animals are well kept, and there's no violation we can cite." Karen's smile faltered. But what about the safety concerns? His animals are a menace. That goose attacked a guest. Jake grinned. "You mean Sergeant Honkers?" "Yeah, he doesn't like trespassers." The inspectors exchanged a glance, clearly unimpressed with Karen's reasoning. "Ma'am, farm animals on a farm are not a violation." Karen's face turned red. But the noise. And the smell. And the second inspector cut her off with a polite but firm tone. "Ma'am, everything here is legal. If there's nothing else, we'll be going." Jake bit back a laugh as Karen sputtered, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to come up with some last-minute accusation. But there was nothing left. The inspectors packed up their things, gave Jake a final nod, and drove off, leaving Karen standing in the dust. She turned to Jake, her hands clenched into fists. "You think this is over?" she hissed. Jake leaned against the fence, giving her an easy grin. "I was hoping it was." Karen took a step forward, her eyes blazing. "You humiliated me. You ruined everything. Do you have any idea how much money that wedding cost? Do you have any idea what I lost because of you?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. HOA members are turning on you." Karen let out a bitter laugh. "Of course they are. They're cowards. They always were. The moment things got tough, they abandoned me." Jake gave a small shrug. "Well, maybe if you hadn't lied, stolen someone's property, and tried to cover it up, they wouldn't have." Karen's jaw clenched so hard he thought she might crack a tooth. "You think you're so untouchable, don't you?" Jake sighed. "Karen, go home." Karen didn't move. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if calming herself before speaking again. "You're going to regret this. I'll find a way to make you pay." Jake's patience had finally run out. "Karen, the only reason you're not in jail right now is because I didn't press charges for trespassing and fraud. So if I were you, I'd walk away and hope I keep feeling generous." For the first time, Karen hesitated. There was a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, maybe, or the realization that she really had lost. Then, with a sharp turn on her heel, she stormed toward her car and sped off down the road. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He knew Karen well enough to know that she wouldn't give up easily. She was the type to dig her claws in until there was nothing left to hold on to. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from one of the HOA members. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Karen is losing control. Thought you'd like to know." Jake smirked. Things were about to get interesting. Jake sat on his porch that evening, sipping a cold drink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was quiet, aside from the occasional sound of his animals settling in for the night. It was a stark contrast to the madness that had unfolded over the past 2 days. He knew it wasn't over, not entirely. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. But the cracks in her empire were showing, and if the message he'd received was any indication, tonight's HOA meeting was going to be her breaking point. He debated whether he should even bother attending. After all, he wasn't part of the HOA, and he had no interest in their petty power struggles. But the idea of watching Karen squirm, seeing her finally answer for all her lies and arrogance, was too tempting to ignore. With a smirk, he stood up, dusted off his jeans, and made his way toward the neighborhood's clubhouse. The meeting was already in full swing when he arrived. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. HOA members sat in their usual formation, but the energy was different this time. There were no polite murmurs or forced smiles. Instead, there were glares, hushed arguments, and a sense of barely restrained anger in the air. At the center of it all was Karen, sitting stiffly in her chair, her fingers gripping the armrests like she was holding on for dear life. Jake leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, enjoying the scene. One of the board members, an older man with a bald head and sharp eyes, stood up and cleared his throat. "All right, let's get to the main issue at hand. We all saw what happened at that wedding. We all know who was responsible." Karen straightened up, forcing a smile. "Yes, and I think we need to discuss the real problem: Jake's complete disregard for community standard. His animals." The bald man held up a hand, cutting her off. "Karen, stop. We're not here to talk about Jake. We're here to talk about you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Karen's face twitched, but she kept her composure. "I don't understand. I did what was best for the community." A woman sitting near the front scoffed. "You stole money from residents. You lied about the wedding venue. You nearly got us all sued. That's not what's best for the community. That's reckless." Karen's jaw clenched. "I was thinking of the community. That wedding was important. It brought prestige, connections. It brought embarrassment," another voice cut in. "And now we're in legal trouble because of it." Jake chuckled under his breath. He had been right. Karen's reign was crumbling, and she had no way to stop it. A man with glasses, who had been silent up until now, spoke up. "There have been discussions about a vote." Karen stiffened. "A vote?" The bald man nodded. "To remove you as HOA president." For the first time, real panic flashed across Karen's face. She sat up straighter, shaking her head. "No. No, you can't do that. I built this HOA. I've kept it running for years. And in those years, you've abused your power," the woman in the front shot back. "You've fined people for ridiculous things, forced unnecessary regulations, and now? You've cost us thousands of dollars because of your arrogance." Karen's hands gripped the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I have always acted in the best interest of this community." A few people laughed bitterly. The bald man sighed, rubbing his temples. "Karen, let's not drag this out. We have enough votes to remove you." She shook her head again, faster this time. "No. No, you don't." The man with glasses pulled out a stack of papers. "We do." Karen's breathing grew shallow. "You can't do this." I refuse to step down." The bald man exhaled. "Karen, you don't have a choice. The vote is happening now." One by one, members raised their hands in favor of removing her. Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but there were none left. Even the few who had supported her in the past kept their hands firmly in their laps, unwilling to risk their own reputations for her. It was over. Karen's face went pale as the realization sank in. She had lost. Completely, utterly lost. Her power, her control, her precious HOA presidency. It was all gone. Jake decided now was a good time to speak. "Well, looks like the community finally decided what was best." Karen turned to him, her eyes filled with pure hatred. "This is your fault." Jake tilted his head. "Oh? Did I tell you to steal money? Did I tell you to host a wedding on private property? Did I tell you to lie to everyone here?" Karen's lips pressed together in a thin line. She knew she couldn't argue against the truth. The bald man cleared his throat. "Karen, you have 1 week to vacate your position. After that, we will elect a new president." Karen stood up so abruptly that her chair scraped against the floor. Without another word, she stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Jake let out a low whistle. "Well, that was fun." The room let out a collective sigh of relief. For the first time in years, it seemed like people could breathe again. As Jake turned to leave, the bald man called after him. "Jake." He stopped, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah." The man gave a small nod. "Thanks. For everything." Jake smirked. "Don't thank me. Thank my cows." The man chuckled. "Fair enough." Jake walked out into the night, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. The HOA had finally rid itself of its worst problem, and Karen was nothing more than a bad memory now. A few days later, Jake got an unexpected visitor. The bride from the disastrous wedding stood at his gate, looking sheepish. He crossed his arms. "Something I can do for you?" She let out a small laugh. "Well, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I had no idea Karen was lying about the venue. If I had known, I never would have gone along with it." Jake studied her for a moment before nodding. "Fair enough. And the lawsuit?" She winced. "Yeah, that's not happening. My dad is suing Karen instead. He's furious." Jake chuckled. "Can't say I blame him." The bride hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you." Jake took it, opening it to find a check. He raised an eyebrow. "It's for the mess," she explained. "I know the wedding caused a lot of damage to your land. It's the least I can do." Jake considered refusing, but then he thought about the cleanup ahead. He nodded. "Appreciate it." She gave him a small smile before turning to leave. "Take care, Jake." As she walked away, Jake glanced down at the check. It wouldn't erase the insanity of the past few days, but it was a decent ending to the whole mess. Sergeant Honkers strutted past him, honking loudly as if celebrating their victory. Jake smirked. "You and me both, buddy." He walked back toward the house, already wondering how long it would take before the HOA tried something stupid again. Whatever it was, he'd be ready.